Now back to the new neck. Since we now know that the neck is pretty much dead flat, we're going to check it one more time just to be thorough. But yeah, it's looking pretty flat right now. And again, I don't know if you can tell, but I'm kind of going from side to side with my left thumb and my right thumb um, on this straight edge, just to see if I can rock it back and forth. Because if I can rock it back and forth, if I hear like a click going back and forth, that'll tell me I have a back bow. So if it's pretty steady on either side, if I can't press down and get a different result, if the light coming through isn't showing a forward bow and I can't rock it back and forth, that generally means we have a flat, level fretboard, and that's what we want before we start doing any work to it. Now, I do have two different fret rockers that I can use. I have the one that comes with the Music Nomad kit, as well as one that I bought separately as part of a toolkit a while ago. They're gonna be about the same in terms of what they do and how well they do it. So, I mean, just for the sake of this, I mean, basically what I'm going to be doing is, depending on which area of the fretboard I'm in, I'm going to use a different side or a different edge of the fret rocker. So basically, you know, when you start off in the first 3 frets, you need the largest coverage, so you're going to use the longer side. And all you're really going to do is go back and forth and check, and if you can rock the fret rocker, that means that the middle fret is a little bit high in relation to one or the other or both. So basically that just tells you that the frets that you are currently rocking on are not all even with each other. So you're just going to go back and forth, and I like to do it kind of across the radius, about where I expect all 6 strings to sit, or at least the middle of each of the 6 strings to sit. You don't have to be that thorough. You can just kind of do a general one, maybe 1, 2, 3, like, you know, different zones. But if you follow about where the strings are going to lie, that'll give you a pretty accurate assessment of whether or not you're going to have to do any releveling. So I'm just going to kind of go back and forth and see if there's any spots where I can, you know, hear it rocking back and forth like that. And then if it does rock back and forth, that'll tell me that there's a spot that I need to relevel. And we'll just kind of get an idea of how level the frets are and see if it needs an entire fret leveling or if there's just some spot leveling we have to do. So again, as you go down the fretboard, when the frets get a little closer together, you might have to switch to a slightly shorter side. And you get a little further down, you switch to a slightly shorter side, all the way down until you get to the very last frets. And by then, you're probably using a really short side here to do that same little rocking back and forth trick. So that's basically how these work. And again, the one that came in the Music Nomad kit, it's basically the same idea. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sides to this one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. So I mean, I'm going to get really exact here, or here, or here, or here, or here. So there's a lot of different sides you can use for this. It functions basically the same way. The important thing is it's machined, it's flat, so it gives you a good reference point for whether or not your frets need to be leveled. So we're going to go through that process. I'm not going to do that on camera because that's super boring, but just going to go through and take a look and see how much work we need to do on the fretboard. Alright, so I did find quite a few spots where the frets were not leveled. I found a couple up here, a few in the middle, and a few at the end. Now, before I actually start removing any material off of the frets, one of the things that's really important to do, especially with cheaper import necks and guitars in general, is to make sure that all the frets themselves are seated properly. So if you look, hopefully I can show this, but there's one that looks pretty visible. I'm going to try to hold this way. So what you're looking to see is if there's any gap between the bottom of the fret, camera's not great, sorry, the bottom of the fret and the actual fretboard, because if there is, that means that the fret could be sitting a little too high. It's not all the way in the groove in the fret slot where it needs to be sitting flush to the fretboard. And if that's the case, you might have to do some work to get it back down. Now there's a couple different ways you can do this. One of the ways that you can do this is with like a fret call, where you have basically like a piece of brass shaped like the fret that matches the radius of the fretboard, and you basically press it in with like a little, like an arbor press basically, to jam the fret down into the fretboard. That's usually a lot more ideal than using a hammer because it won't leave any hammer marks on the fret. And the other advantage of that is that downward pressure is dispersed evenly across the entire fret. So that's always the ideal. I do not have one of those right now though, so the option 2 is going to be using a hammer. Now, just so we are totally clear, no, I am not taking the hammer and directly hitting the fret. That would be a really bad idea. When you have metal going against metal, either one of them will get deformed or both of them will get deformed depending on what kind of metal you're using. I've seen people using brass hammers, and brass is relatively soft compared to steel. However, this is not pure steel. This is nickel steel, so there's some impurities in it. It's a little bit softer than just like stainless steel or high carbon steel, for instance. So because we don't want to leave any hammer marks on the frets, and we don't want to dent the frets down and make them flat when we're trying to reseat them, we're going to be a little bit tactful with how we use the hammer in relation to reseating the frets. So for that, what I have here, and this is very basic, it's just a popsicle stick broken in half with some masking tape around, and all that's going to act as a buffer. So I'm going to lay that across the frets and then carefully hammer that. So I'm indirectly hammering in the fret, but I'm actually striking the surface of the popsicle stick, not the surface of the metal. This way the soft wood will deform first, if anything, and that will make sure that the fret itself stays intact. Now we are going to go back and level these if we need to anyway, but this is always a good first step, is to make sure all the frets are seated properly before we actually start to remove or reshape any of the frets themselves, is just to make sure that the frets themselves are in the correct position in the fretboard. If you go to the removing material stage first, you might find that these frets are going to work themselves out over time anyway, and in fixing that, you may end up chasing issues for a long time, and it's going to be really hard because once you remove material from the frets, you can't effectively add it back on. You can reshape the frets to a degree, and you can recrown them, but you have a limited amount of material that you're working with here. So you want to make sure to preserve as much of it as possible, which is why the first thing we're going to do before we check again to make sure that all the frets are level, we're going to make sure all the frets are seated in properly using this hammer and wooden spacer method to make sure all the frets are seated in properly. So that's going to be next. All right, so I just went through and I'm just going to kind of show you what I ended up doing. Basically, I placed that popsicle stick tape combo on top of the fret, and I just kind of mostly just using the weight of the hammer going up maybe about 5 or 6 inches, came down 1, 2, and just kind of walked across the radius, and just kind of again going across the entire length of the fret using the weight of the hammer itself. So I wasn't like really slamming it, wasn't looking to break the neck in half. I'm just using the wood of the hammer to kind of tap the fret into place if it is loose. So that's all we're really doing here. And you can see, hopefully this is showing up on camera as well, that the fret's actually left a little indent into the wood. That's good, because what that means is that the wood gave before the fret started to take any damage from the hammer. That's kind of the whole point of this. So we were still able to disperse the force into the fret to drive it down without causing any deformation on the actual fret crown itself. That was sort of the whole point of that process. So I am happy with that result. So that said, the frets look like they're sitting all pretty evenly on the fretboard. I don't have any complaints, nothing's really jutting out, and that's not necessarily a sign of bad quality control. It's just one of those things that can happen if you have a guitar that has been across different climates, and the humidity can kind of cause a fretboard to either expand or contract at different rates, and sometimes those frets can just kind of wriggle themselves out. That's why it is usually a good idea to secure your frets once you place them in properly with some kind of CA glue, super glue basically, so that is less likely to happen. But I don't know whether or not they used CA glue. They very well might have. I can't prove that. I didn't see them make the neck, so because we don't want to assume anything, we're just kind of doing our due diligence and making sure that the frets are as secure in the neck as possible. So now that we've done that, let's actually go back and we're going to recheck our, first of all, we're going to recheck our truss rod to make sure the neck is still dead flat. And the second thing we're going to do is then go through and just basically mark off any areas where the frets are still rocking using the fret rocker. So we will do that. So after slightly tweaking the truss rod a little bit to make sure it was dead flat, I went through with the fret rocker again, and everything was pretty much perfect. There were a few tiny high spots that I touched up, but really didn't need a lot of work, if any. And I just kind of went through with some steel wool and shined them up a little bit to make them a little bit smoother. And overall, this neck is looking pretty great. So I think we're ready to move on to the next step. So for the next step, I'm going to grab the StewMac fret end dressing file. And all I'm really going to do here is feel it carefully. And they did a pretty good job with the actual ends. But you can see there's still a little bit of a corner here and here, creating almost like a chisel tip. So we're just going to kind of round off those corners. So I'm going to do that on each of the frets on both sides, once going this way, once going the other way. So kind of coming around to knock off that corner, and then around the other side to knock off that corner, and just kind of rounding each fret end off. So that's going to be a really long, tedious process. I'll again do that off camera. Alright, so now that that's done, next thing I'd actually like to do is do a quick dry fit of the new neck to the body. So let me grab the old body real quick. Honestly, seems like a pretty good fit. I mean, again, holes aren't drilled yet, but seems like the placement's pretty good. So yeah, I'm going to call that a win. It's snug, it's not too tight. I don't feel like I'm going to break anything by putting it in there. And again, with the bolts holding it in place, I think it'll be good. Now the next step of this is going to be figuring out how we plan on installing the old tuners into this, as well as the placement for the two string rollers that we came up with. So to do that, let's grab the old neck. And essentially what we're going to do is, if we look at the nut slot for the D and G string, we're going to try to take that middle point and use that as a reference for where we mount the first string tree, and then same thing for the B and E strings as well, so in the middle of those two. And so we'll just kind of draw a straight line and try to figure out good placement for that. So based on the old neck, which granted probably wasn't, really greatly measured, we're going to figure that out. So as you can see, I've taken some masking tape and just masked off the part of the headstock on the new neck that we're going to be working on. What we're doing now is we are just figuring out what the best placement would be for the string retainers, or in this case the string rollers that we came up with. So based on the placement on the old headstock, we can basically guesstimate that they're about half the distance between the low E string and the A string in terms of distance away from the nut, so somewhere in the middle there. And then the one for the B and E strings is almost exactly where the A string tuner is. So those are good places to start with. So let's actually start off by grabbing, we're just going to use the fret rocker again, and we're going to place that on the A string slot. And I'm going to try to be pretty straight on. It doesn't have to be perfect, but we don't want it curved that way or curved that way. So we want to try to be as parallel with the center line of the neck as possible. So if we say that about here is the A string, okay, and the tuning hole for that is about here, we can push this back a little bit, maybe about here, and right about here is one axis. So let's mark this spot right here. Okay. Now that actually, though, is going to go right about here. So it's really more like here. Again, we're just using the mark that we put on the A string slot as a guide. We're actually going to put that there. And the reason for that spot is that that's right about in the middle of the D string and the G string. So right dead center there is where that spot was. So again, we're trying to keep this fret rocker parallel with the center line, and this is actually right in the center of the neck, is between the D and G strings. So it's rather convenient. So right there is going to be where we do our hole for the first string retainer. The next one is going to be between the B and E strings, and that's going to be about where, I'm just going to kind of poke that in, about where the middle of the A string is. So that, if we go up a little bit, is about here. Well, maybe a little lower. Right about there should be good. So we're going to mark that spot as well with our Sharpie. And that's about where we're going to put that hole. So we have our two marks here and here. And if we look on the old neck, again, just as a point of reference, we can see that that is pretty similar in terms of spacing. So those are the holes that we're going to drill for our string retainer trees. And to drill those holes, we're going to use the 1/16 inch drill bit. And we're going to go up to about 1/4 of an inch, it looks like. Let's just take a look at that actually. And what I'm basing that off of, just so you know, is on the old string retainer with this little spacer here. The distance that the screw is, that's about what we're going for. So if I bring that down a little bit, looks like about 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little less. So that's what our target's going to be. So right about there. Okay, so those holes are now drilled. Sawdust and all. Right, so that's basically what it's going to look like. They're not totally straight right now, but that's okay. Important thing is that they can line up with the tuners that they're meant to go to, which looks pretty good. So we will take that as a win as well. In the next video, I will be tackling the installation of the tuners and also going over what we're going to be doing for finish testing as well. And I think the other thing we have to look at actually is the nut height, which we might wait until after we do the full finishing, get strings on it and do it that way. But we can probably get a pretty good idea. Excuse me. We can probably get a pretty good idea of what the nut height looks like using some of the tools we have at our disposal. So anyway, thank you for watching, and hopefully we'll have some more updates soon.